I don't know if there's anyone out there who can join my support group for bezel-aholics, but this is two watches that really you'd be lucky to have. You'd be happy to have, surely. Sometimes in the office, spontaneous things happen. I recently bought this watch. I brought it in and the whole team are fawning over it. We're talking about it. Another team member, Matt, has a Rolex sub on his wrist. We started asking questions about the differences between the two, the prices, the value proposition, and this is what happened. Well, what happened was the most agonizing deep dive on spec for spec these two Rolex and Tudor watches that are really pitching themselves as genuine dive watches and that have become far more than that. They're cultural icons, they're watches that have many luxury finishings that were never meant to be on dive watches. So in some ways they're quite alike, but we're gonna find pound for pound where they stand in this video. Before we do that, I wanna share an anecdote. I was recently at the launch of this watch and the first Tudor boutique in Australia, in fact. And I was told on the night something I'd never heard about Tudor, which is the origins of the logo. There are two Tudor logos. There's a rose and a shield. And when the watch was first released, there was a rose in isolation and also a rose within a shield. I never thought what that shield meant, but I was told at the event a week ago that the shield is there to protect the crown. Hans Wilsdorf, in his wisdom, introduced the watch in the early 1930s as a way to buffer Rolex from its competitors. And instead of fighting all of his competitors one by one, he created one, which then put a buffer between Rolex and all the brands that wanted to be king. I never knew that. I thought that was a really cool place to start because the shield in those early days was often using Rolex hardware, cases and crowns, but then having a more affordable movement inside. Whereas now we have Tudor very much on the march in terms of starting to level up with Rolex in terms of not only its case and the quality of the watch and build quality of the watch, but also in terms of the movement. So again, grounds for fun, if you ask me. So we're gonna now go through some really, really detailed specs that will pitch the two watches against each other. Of course, I am using the bronze, and that is because I just bought this watch somewhat impulsively. I haven't stopped wearing it since I bought it last week. And I think we can all agree that this represents Tudor's premium platform at the moment, which is the Black Bay 58. Even though we see METAS certified Black Bay 41s coming out now, and we see, a really rapid progression in terms of movement technology at Tudor. So let the games begin. This is the Black Bay 58 Bronze Boutique Edition, and this is the Rolex Submariner 114060, the one before the latest 41mm, slightly larger Submariner. The case diameter is 39mm for the Tudor and 40mm for the Sub. In terms of thickness, we have an 11.6mm case in the Tudor, and we have a 12.6mm case in the Rolex. Lug to lug, however, there is a significant difference, and that is not in the actual size of the case. It's the fact that on the Rolex, we have a center link that is fixed, which means that we must include the center link in the lug to lug measurement, which puts the Tudor at 47.4mm, again, well within that 50mm range, and it puts the Rolex at 50.8. So it's significantly wider on the wrist, and you're going to really feel that difference if you have a slim wrist. Now that extra thickness in the Sub can somewhat or entirely be forgiven for the extra 100 meters of water resistance. The Sub, of course, perhaps the most iconic classic dive watch of all time, is good for 300 meters. It has a triplock crown, which means that many tests have proven that you're going to well exceed that 300 meters. In case of the Tudor Black Bay 58, you have 200 meters of water resistance with a screw down crown. So again, lots of comfort that the watch is going to be more than adequate for most recreational aquatic activities. I have both of these watches in hand, and you're probably thinking, I wonder how they feel. What is the difference in weight? There is a significant difference in weight. The Tudor Black Bay Bronze is 131 grams, and the Sub is 149 grams. So we're talking a full 18 grams extra of weight, which again, you can explain away with the extra hardware that's needed for that 100 extra meters of water resistance. Now, I gave away a little bit about the crown before. The crown of the Tudor is indeed a screw down crown, and it also has quite an interesting textural change to the rest of the case and bracelet. It is a really dulled off bronze as opposed to a really shiny brushed bronze that is more matte than perhaps you've seen from the press pictures. It's a really quite heavily brushed bronze, which really appealed to me. I was worried that seeing this, it would have that kind of yellow gold halo, which of course is going to dull over time, but it doesn't. Due to that really heavy brushing, it's got a very, very dull luster to it that is only going to, in my opinion, I think get more interesting with time as that tone of yellow turns more to a burnished gold. We will get into this bronze in more detail. Sit tight for that. There's a few more stats. Now, aside from the bronze, and the bronze bracelet, and the fact that they're both in a 39mm watch, the most exciting thing for people about, it seemed to be in the feedback about the new boutique edition, is this T-fit clasp, which allows you to micro adjust the clasp, a first for Tudor. Now, we thought it'd be interesting to see how this compares to the Glidelock clasp of the Rolex, and it turns out there's a really interesting difference. This T-fit clasp adjustment has 5 increments, which expands the watch bracelet by 8mm. The Glidelock, on the other hand, on the Rolex, actually expands the bracelet by a whopping 20mm. And you can see from the motion of both, they're very smooth, very easy to operate, but you get a 20mm 2-link equivalent adjustment possibility with the sub versus about half of that with the Tudor. Now, I have to say, I have a 7-inch wrist and I have absolutely no problems getting to a really comfortable place with the Tudor method. However, please note, it is not exactly the same as Glidelock, and you are going to have exactly half of the amount of rope to play with in terms of getting this watch snug for your wrist. Okay, let's talk movements, because surely this is where the differences become really apparent. The Rolex is powered by the caliber 3130, which offers 48 hours of power reserve, but more importantly than power reserve is accuracy. This model, like all Rolex models, submits to the superlative chronometer certification, which is +2 to -2 seconds of variance a day, which is extraordinary. To have a mass manufactured product that can be that accurate, that is mechanical, is why Rolex has the brand cachet and esteem that it has today. It's one of the very big reasons. How does that compare with the Tudor? It is no slouch either. This is the NT5400 movement, which is COSC certified, meaning there's a guaranteed accuracy of -4 +6 seconds a day. And in case you don't know what that means, it means that you can be forgiven within that band of accuracy. And in terms of power reserve, you get a much bigger 70 hours of power reserve, meaning you can take it off on Friday, put it back on Monday morning, and you don't need to wind the watch. Now, in terms of case materials, we obviously have a very big point of difference, which is that this boutique edition Black Bay 58 is in bronze. The big question is, how will this bronze patina, how will it age? And I can tell you, having seen the Black Bay 43 with solid brown dial age over time on my brother's wrist, it is the same alloy. It is an aluminium heavy alloy, which means that it is really even in the way that that color changes from what could be perceived in its early days as yellow gold to something much more burnished. It's sort of a darker, almost like a gray gold that is very even across the surfaces of the watch. The Rolex is in my favorite steel on the planet, 904L steel. I have worn a Rolex GMT Master 2 for many years and frankly never encountered a steel bracelet as comfortable. It feels like liquid on the skin. It is in a class of 1 as far as I'm concerned in terms of a grade of steel, pretty much peerless in terms of a material to be worn on the skin. All right, let the details continue. This is Time+Tide, this is what we do. The bezel, what's the difference here? On the sub, we have a ceramic bezel with 120 clicks. And look, I don't know if there's anyone out there who can join my support group for bezel-aholics, but this is surely one of the nicest sounding, nicest feeling bezels you have ever experienced. My gosh, I'll do that all day. 120 clicks on that bad boy. On this one, we have an aluminium bezel. I actually like aluminium bezels more than ceramic, if I'm honest. They're cheaper to replace. They age with grace and they show a little age of the watch as opposed to ceramic. But really, again, the comfort of a ceramic bezel is that sheer extra level of protection, an extra level of toughness. Let's do a click difference. Oh, immediately, this one jumps a lot further between clicks. This is a 60 click bezel, and it has a very different tone. It's nice and deep, and certainly the tolerances of the bezel are very tight with a reassuring sort of, not rubbery, but there's a softness to it as well, but also being very firm. We've had great feedback on my bezel reviews, which is why I'm delving really deep on this one. But again, tiny differences, tiny details that make these watches quite different to wear on the wrist. In terms of that bronze bracelet, and in terms of the case back, one of the most common questions I get about this watch already is, will the case back bleed off onto my skin, and will the bracelet leave green marks? I've been wearing this watch continuously for a week. Granted, it is not summer. If I was sweating, there's always a little bit more residue. When you sweat, it hasn't been that happening because it's the middle of winter here and it's freezing. But I have had zero discoloration of my wrist, despite having the watch on wrist for a week. So that is the answer there. I've waxed lyrical about this bracelet. I'm not going to say anything else. Of course, it doesn't leave any residue. Of course, it doesn't leave any marks. It is absolute silk on the skin. Best bracelet in the world. One detail I forgot, which is the rivets on this Black Bay 58 bracelet. Look, the fact that this upsets people just shows you how absolutely disproportionately we love watches, because it really doesn't matter. It's an aesthetic touch. They're not functional rivets. It's a bit like the, okay, are you okay with the screws on a Royal Oak? You are? Great. Very similar situation here. Aesthetic, pleasing, not a big deal. One last point about the bracelets, the taper. I mean, this is by far the most agonizingly detailed review we've ever done at Time+Tide, and we're just going even deeper. The bracelet taper on the Black Bay is from 19 millimeters at the case down to 16 millimeters at the deployant. So there's a 3 millimeter taper. On the sub, we have a 19.7 millimeter bracelet, and you can really feel the extra jut of the lugs there. That's quite different to the Tudor. There's a lot less sort of space between the edge of the case and the bracelet. 19.7 millimeters at the top, right down to 15.3 at the base. So a slightly more aggressive taper, but hardly aggressive. In closing, two watches that really you'd be lucky to have, you'd be happy to have. This is a battle of A+ versus, you know, maybe A+ within price bracket. So there wasn't a winner here. It's really just to show that there are nuanced and important differences between the two. They're very much siblings. Like, as you unpack these watches, the sheer quality of the wear, the experience, the ride, very similar. So well done Rolex, Tudor, dominant for a reason. Two beautiful watches, one $6,160, one $11,400 for the new 41 millimeter model. Both money very well spent. Lastly, another detail that we took down in our incredibly laboratory-like scientific tests is the accuracy of these actual watches. The new Tudor proved to be +2 seconds a day, and the Rolex was -4 seconds a day, which again is pretty forgivable for a watch that is nearly a decade old. Thank you very much for watching. Like I said, this was a fun conversation that turned into a deep geek dive. So apologies if it was too much. You wouldn't be watching by now if it was. Thank you if you are. See you next time.